So welcome back. And so here we are at the Keynote, and we have a fantastic speaker this evening. When we invited him, quite a few weeks ago now, it already seemed like a very topical subject, but all the more so these days. And so the title is Psychological Inoculation Against Misinformation. And Sander van der Linden, one of my colleagues here at Churchill, is a professor of social psychology in society and director of the Cambridge Social Decision-Making Lab in the psychology department. And so we're going to hear from Sander. I might throw a few questions at him while you get warmed up, and then it's over to you again for some questions. So Sander, take it away. Thanks so much.
Thanks so much for the invitation. It's great to be here. I guess I should apologize in advance that I'm a psychologist, and so I study individual processes, but we try to do a bit of work as it relates to system level and incentives, so I'll try to throw some of that in. In fact, I was at the House of Lords earlier this week. They gave me the mandate to shake things up a bit. And so one of the things I did was, I was there to speak to them about information threats to the United Kingdom and how to build digital policy and resilience in the UK, information resilience. One of the things I did was I gave them a fake news quiz, and I quote, I said, "This was most unusual." And so, you know, I won't tell you how it did. So I like to do this quiz. People don't know this quiz, do participate. So the stories were all widely reported, all of these. 2 of them are fake. I'm asking you which of these is true. A, Putin issues international arrest warrant for George Soros. Who thinks that that's true? Show of hands. Well, faith in Putin. Oh, there we go. Okay. All right, some hands. How about B, baby born in California named Hard Eyes Emoji? Who thinks that that's true? Okay, well, most people think that that's true. It's funny because when I give this talk in California, most people in California also think that the answer is B. But if you didn't raise your hand, now you're left with C. Criminal farts so loudly, he gives away his hiding place. Okay, that's pretty good. That is indeed the right answer. That really happened. There was a criminal who was hiding in the bushes, and he passed gas so loudly that he gave away his own hiding spot when he was running away from the sheriff's department. And it happened in Missouri. They even tweeted when you're having a hashtag shit day. But yeah, okay. Enough with the fart jokes. Just to give you a little taste, so we actually developed a more serious instrument called the Misinformation Susceptibility Test, which is one of the problems in this literature is that, unlike other areas of psychology, there's no standardized psychometric instrument to benchmark people in the whole population in terms of some ability. You know, whether we have things for IQ, personality, but not misinformation susceptibility. So we developed this quiz over several years, actually using AI to generate some of the items just to make sure that you know, people had never seen the headlines before, because that's a challenge with a news kind of assessment. And Yara, who's also here, one of our brilliant PhD students, and Raccoon, who's now at Oxford, co-developed this test. And it's been adopted by YouGov and other places, and you get some really interesting results in terms of how people do. So we ask people 20 headlines, and people, you know, get a score, and they get some feedback in terms of how discerning they are. Are you saying everything is false as a response pattern, or everything's true? How gullible versus how skeptical are you? Or how good are you actually discerning between the two? And if you sort of block them in different deciles, that's what YouGov did, you see people who don't do so good on this test, kind of like the one I showed you before, you get most of your news from Snapchat, Truth Social, WhatsApp, and TikTok, whereas the highest scoring people get most of their news from the Associated Press, NPR, public radio, sort of traditional news. But actually, if you look at the populations most susceptible, 18 to 29-year-olds, so Gen Z, and this comes in our data as well. So this app is live, so we have hundreds of thousands of people who go through this quiz, so we have big data that we can crunch, and we have a new paper forthcoming. And one of the big differences is Gen Z, who actually, even though they're digital natives, they perform lower on this test, which is an interesting finding. Now, I suppose I don't have to tell you much about the consequences of misinformation on society, but here's some examples. During the pandemic, people were setting phone masts on fire in the UK because of crazy 5G conspiracy theories, right? That somehow coronavirus was exacerbated or caused by 5G, which we know isn't true. Not just a Western phenomenon. In Iran, there were excess hospitalizations. People were on social media that drinking methanol cures the COVID virus, including children, so serious business. Of course, the Southport riots we've seen in the UK last summer, which, of course, there's multiple problems going on here in terms of inequality and attitudes towards immigration, but what started it was a fake news story posted on social media that the attacker arrived by boat and was an asylum seeker, which was total nonsense, which was, of course, the fuel that actually caused the national riots. What interests me, and I should say this, so Haitian families in Ohio were attacked because Trump said that they're eating cats and dogs. I'm not a fact checker, right? So I'm a psychologist, so I'm interested in the process by which people arrive at their beliefs. But one of the things that interests me are repeated tropes throughout history. So actually, it's not so much about the sort of cats and dogs, but the fact that immigrants are eating unsavory things is actually a propaganda trope that's been used throughout history, and that's kind of what fascinates me. And I'll show you some more examples. There's a military convoy heading to Ukraine. This is actually Southern California. This is a cheap fake that went viral on Facebook during the conflict. Of course, we have Putin claiming that the war in Ukraine was to target Nazis. The Capitol riots that are, of course, well known. Israel, Hamas, a lot of fake imagery going around. Again, stuff's being recycled. So this image is from Arma 3, which is a first-person shooter game, which was also used in the Russia-Ukraine war. And so one of the questions that I'm interested in is, what are some of the techniques that are used throughout the production of misinformation that are somehow predictable, but we fail to anticipate and seem to confuse people in high-stakes situations? I mean, misinformation is a problem in terms of direct consequences, right, to people's health, but it's also indirect in that it builds over time. And the first casualty of war is truth, as they say. But misinformation intersects with all other societal challenges. It makes it more difficult to address climate change, economic inequality, right? We have wars, we have public health. And so misinformation sort of seeps into and intersects with all of these challenges. Natural disasters, huge problems, diverting resources to fake stories about people that may have been hurt in a shopping mall. This happened in Spain. People, resources were misdirected because of a fake story during a crisis situation, which can be quite intense. Let's look at the last election. These are statements about the economy and immigration and correlations with how people voted. So violent crime rates are at a near all-time high in major American cities. That's false, and we know that's false because people have checked it. So if you didn't answer this correctly, you have 26 more percent points here of voting Republican. Inflation in the U.S. has declined over the last year, or I should say voting for Trump. Inflation in the U.S. has declined over the last year and is near historical averages, which is true. Again, if you got this incorrectly, there was some points here towards Trump. U.S. stock market is at near all-time highs. And over the last few months, unauthorized border crossings are near at lowest level in the last few years, which is true. So if you didn't get that correct, you were more likely to vote for Trump. Of course, there's a causal question here are elites like Trump misinforming people, or are people demanding the misinformation, and that's what's driving their votes? I mean, that would be a much scarier option if you ask me. But what's clear is that people have misperceptions, influential misperceptions about the economy that affects or potentially affects their voting in some way. This is a gentleman that is concerned about the mRNA vaccine, saying, well, change your DNA. One of the things about this is interesting, right? New technology, people are worried, and they have legitimate questions. But what's interesting to me is not, is this true or false? Is this a technique that's been used before? Actually, if you go back towards the first vaccine in the 1800s, which was, of course, Edward Jenner's cowpox vaccine against smallpox, you actually see interesting propaganda from anti-vax communities in the 1800s that if you took the cowpox vaccine, you were going to turn into a human-cow hybrid. And yes, you laugh. There's images, there's evidence of this. So you have cows sprouting, udders sprouting out of your face, all sorts of crazy stuff. They were trying to scare people about the vaccine. It's going to change your DNA. They didn't have the word DNA at the time, but the idea that the vaccine is going to change your body is 200 years old, and it's a propaganda technique. And that's what I'm interested in inoculating people against, not so much telling people what they need to believe, but rather sort of uncovering these manipulation techniques. So what is misinformation? I chaired a consensus panel where we talked about this for a long time, and so we sort of defined it as both false and misleading information. Because, simple errors are not that interesting. Sometimes somebody makes a mistake. Technically, that's misinformation. But disinformation, which is misinformation coupled with some intention to deceive or harm other people, is much more concerning. And propaganda is disinformation with some political or commercial agenda that can be state-run or doesn't have to be state-run. So I try not to use the term fake news because it's very imprecise. So we think about misinfo, disinfo, and propaganda. But I want to say one thing about this definition of what's false or not, because misleadingness is a much bigger problem. If you look at quantifications of the landscape, of total exposure. Most people are not exposed to the earth is flat type of nonsense on a daily basis. So the total exposure, the volume is not that high. But if you define misinformation as misleading, lacking context, presenting opinion as fact, manipulation techniques, logical fallacies, that actually is a much bigger problem. Yara and I wrote this other paper trying to, kind of visualize this for people based on the findings of a science paper, showing that actually misleading news is the bigger problem here. And this study actually found that misleading news had 50 times bigger impact on vaccine intentions than fact-checked misinformation. So stuff that's obviously false is not as influential as things that are more subtle in its manipulation, right? It might use a grain of truth, but are otherwise manipulative. Okay. Then there's also bad incentives, right? So we looked at social media. We do a lot of big data work on social media. So we scrape millions of data points from social media, and we're trying to predict what goes viral on social media, or what gets engagement. And one of the things that we found, particularly in the US context and the UK context, is outgroup animosity. So what's happening here? So we look at words on social media and whether they're the in-group or the out-group. So if a liberal politician says Donald Trump has lied more than 3,000 times since taking office, but Republicans refuse to say Trump is a liar, that's 3 out-group words. That's if you're a liberal, if you're a conservative, then every American needs to see Joe Biden's latest brain freeze. That's 1 out-group word. And then we predict, controlling for lots of things, right? It's observational research, so the length of the tweet, the post, whether it's a picture, video, number of followers, and so on. We try to predict reshares and retweeting. And so the percentage change that you see here is for liberal media. You can see that outgroup derogation is the most, in terms of the effect size, the most significant, but that's also true for conservative media. So that's a 28 to 57% increase in engagement for outgroup derogation compared to in-group bolstering, as well as compared to just negativity and moral language. That's true for members of Congress as well, both liberal and conservative members of Congress. 58 to 180% increase in engagement wasn't moderated by the platform or ideology. So that seems to indicate that dunking on the other side gets traction, and we've labeled that the perverse incentives of social media. In fact, the ha-ha and angry reactions receive the most engagement. So some of these systems are designed, right, to elicit toxicity and low-quality content from people. So the question is, what do we do about these things? And I want to talk a little bit about inoculation. This is a picture of Madrid. I'm not sure, you probably want me showing you this. So there's 3.5 million people in Madrid. Here's the flag of Spain. Is there anyone here from Madrid? Okay. Spain? Okay, but not from Madrid. That's good. Lots of people in Madrid. No value judgments here. Tons of people. Madrid is the most populous city in Europe. Tons of people in Madrid. Most populous city in Europe. Here's population growth of Madrid. Boop. Lots of people in Madrid. So the question is, it used to be London, by the way, but then there was this whole exit situation. So now it is Madrid. So if I now tell you that actually this was total nonsense, Madrid is not the most populous city in Europe, you have to engage in a process that psychologists refer to as negation in the brain, which is very difficult. So negating content is a psychological challenge because now you have to flag something that you thought was maybe true as false, and then lots of things can go wrong. And meta-analyses actually show that fact-checking and debunking, the 2 most prominent tools that we've had to challenge misinformation, is only partially effective because of this concept of the continued influence of misinformation. We know that when people are exposed to a falsehood or misinformation, it integrates into your memory. Your memory is like a social network. It has nodes, it has links, hundreds, thousands of them. So when you think that something is true, it seeps into all sorts of links with other concepts that you have in your mind. And so then when you try to correct it, it's like a game of whack-a-mole, that you might inactivate one node, but another node pops up somewhere else. And that's a really big problem. Here's the latest meta-analysis of debunking with an average effect of 0 on correcting people's misperceptions. There's a lot of heterogeneity here, so I actually think if you do debunking well, if you do fact-checking well, it can have an effect. It just won't eliminate the influence of misinformation. If you put people in brain scanners to try to figure out why is that, there's some competing explanations of what is actually happening. So one is the mental model approach. So people fail to integrate the correction into their mental model of how something works, and the other is called a selective retrieval error. When the brain accesses information, it does so retrieving true and false information concurrently, and you have to suppress the false information based on some tag that it's incorrect. What happens is that people fail to suppress it, and so you're still retrieving it in your reasoning. So if I tell you that, oh, I went down this place on, next to you on down your street, I got this massive food poisoning, terrible. I was up the whole night. Shouldn't go there again. Then a week later, I tell you, actually, it wasn't that place on your street. It was some other place. Every time you're going to pass that place, you're going to think food poisoning, right? So you can't unring a bell, and that's really the challenge with debunking. People continue to retrieve the falsehoods. And so that's why we looked at the idea of pre-bunking. Pre-bunking is all about, can we prevent people from encoding misinformation in the first place, and specifically through a process known as psychological inoculation. So what is psychological inoculation? It doesn't require a needle, but I do like this picture. The idea is that instead of giving people just more facts, you actually expose them to a weakened dose of the misinformation, counterintuitively, and refute and deconstruct that misinformation in advance for people so people can build up cognitive antibodies and become more resistant to the full dose of misinformation in the future. You can actually measure those cognitive antibodies in all sorts of ways. Can people discern better? Can they generate resistance? How motivated are they? Sometimes people even have physiological responses to an inoculation. And so the analogy with vaccination is exact. In that just as vaccines trigger the production of antibodies to help confer resistance against future infection, turns out you can do the same with information. So the brain needs lots of microdose examples of what manipulation looks like in order to neutralize it, just as your body needs lots of examples of potential invaders in terms of what they look like in order to search and neutralize them, right, to generate appropriate resistance. So in the literature, this is called refutational preemption, but we've relabeled that pre-bunking so it's easier for people to understand. So, we get people in the lab, and then we give them the pre-bunk, and then we let them browse the internet and find people become more resistant to misinformation. But one of the challenges was, okay, how do you scale this? You can't just have people come into the Cambridge lab and, the whole population coming in. That doesn't work, obviously. Two, can you make a broader scale, like a broad spectrum vaccine? We can synthesize a weakened dose out of a specific example, but can you make this more general? Like, if you inoculate against the building blocks of, let's say, conspiracy theories, then regardless of what the conspiracy theory is, can people be inoculated? And then how do you do this in a way that actually engages people? So we took some inspiration from, I'll tell you that in a second. In fact, we got these headlines. Cambridge scientists, they love this one in the UK. It's possible to vaccinate Americans against fake news. Yeah. Don't worry, in the US, I substituted with Brits. But Cambridge scientists consider fake news vaccine. A BBC journalist actually called us and asked if this was fake news. And I said, you decide. Right, Severus Snape. There was some rumor going around that was started by the library here that we were the Defense Against the Dark Arts Lab. Harry Potter wasn't my generation, but I decided to look into it. And I actually found the dark arts analogy interesting. So, regardless of the whole J.K. Rowling thing, I think this is my ode to Alan Rickman, let's say, that I found his character quite interesting in that, the students weren't just kind of digesting the facts from a book. They were actually, actively fighting the dark arts in the classroom, and it was quite dangerous in a way, in that in order to learn how to overcome it, you need to experience a simulation of it, right? And so that's what we decided to do. We created a game called Bad News. John Rosenbeek, who was at Cambridge, now at King's, was, the sort of creative engine behind a lot of this. And Bad News actually lets people step into the shoes of an online manipulator. So there's a perspective-taking exercise that what if we let people walk a mile in the shoes of an online manipulator, expose them to weakened doses of the techniques that are often used to manipulate people, and let people generate resistance, right, just as the body generates resistance in a fictional environment. So it's safe, right, we can dose, not actual misinformation. So here you go. Here's Donald Trump. I'm back. Great idea, Joe. By executive order, I'm renaming Canada to North Dakota. Hashtag you got annexed. Did we have a Canadian in the room previously? Yeah, good. So we actually created this item 3 years ago before thinking that it would be a weekend dose because it would be so ridiculous that nobody, even Trump wouldn't say that. But, you know, we were proven wrong. Credit to John Rosenbeek. So the idea is to gain as many followers as possible without losing credibility. Because if you're just being foolish, then nobody's going to buy your manipulation, right? So mainstream media, one massive conspiracy, hashtag fake news. You create your own echo chamber. We're doing Elon Musk now because, you know, he's the king of trolling. So here we go, Elon Musk. Doge investigation confirms that UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer was the inspiration for Mr. Darcy from hashtag Bridget Jones' Diary. What else are the Brits hiding? And so, you know, it's a fun way to explain the concept of trolling to people. And so, you know, you get responses, you get a lot of traction, you build your own echo chamber, people learn about these techniques, and then they move on. So what do we actually inoculate people against, right? Polarization, creating us versus them mentalities, you know, impersonating doctors online, fake cures, politicians, conspiracy theories, trolling, we talked about those, fear-mongering, like the vaccine example I showed you, and discrediting the mainstream using denial and doubt. This is the case with climate change, you know, casting doubt on the science and the scientific consensus. And then this thing went viral online one day, and then we were able to collect some data. I should say it's all based on reality, even though it's fictional. So somebody impersonated Warren Buffett on Twitter, back in the Twitter days. There's a T missing. Got hundreds of thousands of followers, and this account was tweeting out nonsense like, you know, invest in what makes you happy. And, you know, people were duped. But today I realized that there's another esteemed gentleman with the same potential risk, Peter Bennett, also double T. And so we use this example actually in the game to inoculate people against impersonation. So, you know, most people don't actually spot this error the first time around, but, you know, once they're inoculated against impersonation, the idea is that they're more likely to see it. So here's John. This thing went viral, so we had hundreds of thousands of people going to this intervention, and a small percentage opt into research, so we had about 30,000 data points, about 15,000. We asked people pre-post with a little quiz before and after the 15, 20-minute simulation. Real news, people find this credible before and after, but for the items that use manipulation techniques, people find it significantly less reliable after playing. Didn't really matter if you were left, right, young, old, lower, higher educated. People start at different levels. This is the density of the data, right? These are medians. But the intervention effect was similar. Now, of course, you can say people who opt into this type of stuff are open-minded and the whole density is on the lower susceptibility end. And so how are you going to, you know, this is kind of a fun science experiment. How are you going to scale this into a real policy solution? So first we did some more experiments. We did some randomized controlled trials. We did longitudinal experiments to see how long it lasts. Turns out people need booster shots because the effect decays over time. In fact, we just have a publication out in Nature Comms this week where we modeled the decay curve of the inoculation effect, so we know exactly what the decay function is, and then we try to boost it through either memory or people's motivation, because those are the mechanisms that underlie the inoculation effect. And then the Foreign Office actually said, you know, we have a mission to promote media literacy around the world, and the Foreign Office helped us scale this intervention in every major country around the world. So the Foreign Office translated this in pretty much every major culture now, and so we could do large cross-cultural trials and look at that data. We've gone into Global South, Brazil, India, required a huge amount of adaptation and lots of nuance that I'm happy to talk about. Was much more difficult to make this work in the Global South because of literacy differences. I think the biggest distinction is actually rural versus urban, not so much west or south versus north. But I can say more about that. There have been systematic reviews of this approach, meta-analyses showing that inoculation helps people sort of discern. We have a version for kids called Bad News Junior. You're impersonating the headmistress that school's out. But, you know, same techniques, but much more age-appropriate. And then the pandemic hit, and the government, the director of government communications called us and said, look, we want to do something novel. There's a lot of incoming misinformation. What can we do? You know, we're out there fact-checking. And so we said, look, there's an opportunity to actually implement pre-bunking at a policy level, a population level, and inoculate as many people as we can against the most common techniques that will be used during the pandemic to mislead people. And I didn't really think the government was going to go for that, because they're the government, and they take a long time often. But actually, I got a call back, and they said, let's do it. How fast can you produce this game? So, we spent a few months, and Cambridge was very helpful in allowing us to focus on this and actually produce it. So we produced Go Viral with the UK government. Then the United Nations came on board and helped us scale this intervention internationally. We were part of the World Health Organization's Stop the Spread campaign. This actually became the most popular page on the WHO's webpage. I can tell you, Go Viral was not the name we wanted to give this game. We wanted to name it Unmasked. One joke about the WHO and the whole mask situation, but the other was unmasking the manipulation techniques. And if you want to build trust with audiences, sometimes it's important not to take yourself too seriously, but the WHO didn't think that was funny. And so they were kind of like, we need to explain to people how information goes viral on the internet. And so that's kind of what the name became. We did randomized controlled trials in 3 different countries at the same time. We had the big data from the online version, and then once we knew it worked, we scaled it. We were able to reach about 200 million people with this intervention, and the government won some award for being innovative in leading this, which was the first big pre-bunking campaign that we ran. I won't bore you with all the data. It works the same as Bad News, but now it's a messaging group, and here's your Joel joining a group called Not Afraid, University Camford expert, lizard people behind coronavirus outbreak. Ridiculous stuff, but it gets the point across of some of the key techniques, fear-mongering, conspiracy theories, and impersonating doctors, and stuff like that. We did one with the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Agency, actually, in Homeland Security in the previous election, not the most recent one, but the one before that Trump claimed was stolen. And actually, we were working on securing the integrity of the election against foreign interference with Homeland Security. And so we produced this game with Chris Krebs' team, who was the head of CISA at the time and fired by Trump because he kept debunking Trump's related fraud claims. And so it was an interesting time, but this thing went live, and we used the pineapple pizza metaphor to explain foreign interference to the American public, which is that you take an innocuous issue like, should you put pineapple on pizza? Is there anyone from Italy here? Italians? No? Yes? I just actually tried it at the Maple, and they're pure. They said no pineapple for you. On the pizza. And so, you start this idea, this is offensive, this is cultural appropriation, nobody should put pineapple on pizza. Then the other side says, nobody's going to restrict my pizza topping freedoms. Then you buy bots, you blow up the debate, you disrupt societal discourse, right? So it's a weekend kind of dose, but they do this with immigration, abortion, climate change, right? Real topics. The last thing I want to talk about before I imagine it's time, yeah, is a study funded by Google with initially good intentions. And they said, look, you have this interesting thing, but it's opt-in, right? People volunteering to participate. Okay, the WHO might be targeting people that they think are susceptible, but what if you did videos? So we want to help you do the right thing. So what if we create videos, 30 seconds, 60 seconds for social media? You know those annoying ads on YouTube that you can't skip? What if we put those pre-bunks in the ad space and scale it across billions of people all at once, and it would be non-skippable? And we thought, wow, that's a brilliant idea. Let's do that. So we created these videos, and slightly different from news, more manipulation techniques like false dilemma, scapegoating, minority groups, and so on. And then people would get a test, manipulative versus non-manipulative content, and see if people discern. And we did lots of lab experiments, and then science said, okay, you've done many of these experiments. Let's see now that it actually works on YouTube. Google had to strong-arm YouTube for about a year to actually allow us to test it on the YouTube platform, but we did. We actually had an opportunity to do that. But they didn't want to talk about anything real, climate change, immigration, they want to be arbiters of truth. So they said, can you find a weakened dose that's completely inactivated? So John actually went back to popular culture. We found an example from Star Wars on the false dilemma, which I thought was great. Politicians love to use false dilemmas, right? So either it's this or that. They take away all the nuance, which actually breeds extremism, right? So either you're for you're either for this proposal or against this proposal. There's no nuance. So the structure of that is the same as from Star Wars. When Obi-Wan Kenobi is talking to Anakin Skywalker, who, spoiler alert, goes on to become Darth Vader. I'm not going to do the whole Luke, I'm your father. But basically, he says, if you're not with me, then you're my enemy. And then Obi-Wan replies, only a Sith deals in absolutes, right? And the narrator says, don't use these manipulation techniques, don't join the dark side. So that's kind of the inoculation. But then we test people with real false dilemmas. Why give illegal immigrants access to social services? We should be helping domestic, homeless people instead. And then we give people the neutral version, the nuanced kind of version that you would have in a real policy setting maybe. And people got this test within 24 hours. So it wasn't direct. So it's not that people were watching this ad and then doing the quiz. There was a 24-hour delay on average between the inoculation and the test. Funnily enough, for a company that's a billion-dollar company, right, they don't have any infrastructure to test people. They just have like brand ads. So we hijacked the brand lift software that they have to do science in terms of testing people. And actually what we found was this is red is discernment, blue is manipulative. So people find, for all of these techniques, they find them more manipulative, they're better discerners, they're more likely to recognize these techniques, and they're less likely to share it, more or less. And then in the real experiment, the effects were a lot smaller, but they were still there. So this is when people are actually on YouTube, right? Consumers of political news on YouTube. The effects in the lab were quite big for psychology, but then in the wild, they were much smaller, about a 5 to 10% boost. Initially, I thought this was small, but then I learned that companies invest millions for a 1% increase in brand recognition because they know a 1% increase translates into X amount of sales. So for a 30-second ad that cost YouTube almost nothing, a 10% boost was actually quite significant. Now, they didn't end up making this mandatory, but Google did end up doing huge campaigns in Germany, decontextualization, fear-mongering, whataboutism. They reached over half the German population online with this approach. Companies did change their product policies. Meta instituted a preemptive misinformation management program based on this, so they changed their actual products. Not anymore, I should say. Google used it during the European elections here. We've created a method to do this on Instagram now. We've written a handbook for NATO during wartime, how to implement this. Deepfakes, right? Here we have the Pope, Starmer being deepfaked. Actually, people can't detect deepfakes very well, do very bad at it. People are very vulnerable to that. Financial incentives, the economist's favorite tool, doesn't actually improve accuracy because people don't have the skills. But the inoculation boosted people's detection actually by 80%. And this is an undergraduate project that we're running for the final year students actually right now. The most, and I'll stop talking, the most important application, I think, in the real world that I've seen was a joint US-UK operation where Biden actually took our pre-bunk structure and used it against Putin's invasion. So the idea was that the UK and the US were sitting on intelligence that Russia was going to invade Ukraine. They weren't, entirely certain about this, but they had propaganda videos where it seemed as if Ukrainian soldiers were in Russian soil. And so they said to people, there's going to be a fake plot. They warned people in advance, which is part of the inoculation. But then they also showed this is a propaganda video. You're going to see these troops, and they're going to make it seem as if it's one thing. Here's how it works. And so they deconstructed the technique. And they say, and I can't verify this because it's based on intelligence, but that it delayed the invasion by a number of days. Of course, Putin found another pretext to invade, obviously. And so it's all relative in terms of solutions. But if you can temporarily throw off an invasion, I think that's not a bad deal. We have incorporated into the Digital Services Act. So the EU took these findings and written it into the Digital Services Act. Very large online platforms have to do these things. Of course, it's going to be a question, are they actually enforcing the DSA now that the US is threatening them? That's another question. We've come up with a dashboard that displays the cost of manipulation in real time, which is led again by Yara and Anton in the business school. Not a psychology intervention, but actually we're trying something from the supply side. So we're actually tracking the cost of creating fake accounts across all social media platforms in all countries, displaying it in real time so that policymakers can see what the cost is of manipulation in their country, and that social media companies can actually see how easy it is to buy fake accounts on their platforms. It's not live yet, but we'll be rolling it out next month during the Disinfo Summit that we host here at Cambridge. And I'll end it there. I'll say that I mentioned this because the students in the group received the Research Impact Award from Cambridge, but I think it's only because of the teamwork, and I think we did all this work, and that's only possible because all the great people that are in our group that make this possible. So thanks very much, and happy to have a discussion.
Gosh, that's fascinating. I'm sure there are loads of questions in the room. I'm just going to start until people warm up. It's about how bad is the problem. So as you will know, there has been some pushback about how serious a societal problem this misinformation is. What's your view about how much we should worry about it?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I think I would break it down into this sort of distinction between how you define misinformation, because how serious of a problem it is kind of based on how you define it, because that determines how you measure it. So if you define misinformation as stuff that's 100% fabricated, then you're going to find that most people are not exposed to that type of content very often. If you define it as broadly misleading information, then you find that actually lots of people are exposed to that. So it kind of depends on, to some extent, we have this position that we term the minimizers, which is like when you want to minimize a problem, you define it away to the smallest possible slice that you can find. So we think it's fairer to sort of look at both and say both are a problem, but in terms of scope, it's a much bigger problem if you expand the definition to not just the crazy stuff. The other I would say is about tail risks. So even though most people might not be persuaded by ludicrous misinformation, the minorities that are can cause real disproportionate damage. We've seen that with the Capitol riots in the US based on the conspiracy that the election was stolen, also with the riots here over the summer. I think there's inequality, right? So if you look at the distribution of information quality, some people are drowning in misinformation, some communities are embroiled, whereas others are in mostly factual communities. And so the distributions are very unequal, which creates, I think, different types of risks. So I would say that overall we sort of shouldn't estimate the lingering risk, which is that not just the direct risk of, yes, if you read something that's false and you ingest it and you're going to harm yourself, but actually, Hitler didn't convince Germany overnight that we should put people, in concentration camps. He started out in a much more reasonable fashion. It was a little bit of this, a little bit of that. Over time it builds. I think the risk with misinformation is similar in that it sort of seeps into decreasing trust in official institutions, decreasing trust in media, creating broad-scale resentment, increasing polarization, information inequality, public health. It sort of seeps into all levels. And then at some point it accumulates and boils over. And those are more of the sort of the indirect consequences, I think, of misinformation. And so, why do people vote a certain way? Why are people polarized? Why are people have views about immigration? I think people people are not born with some pre-existing attitude towards, let's say, immigrants. I think people have been exposed in the past to information that might not be accurate, and that's how beliefs and attitudes form over time. So there's this sort of cumulative risk that's much more difficult to measure and quantify, and that's why I think some people misunderstand the scale and scope of the problem.
Just one more from me, and you alluded to it at the end of your talk, and you've obviously had a lot of impact with governments and the UN organizations. What do you think about the position of the big tech companies, which is clearly changing now in the United States? Yeah,
I would say it's changing a lot. Initially, even when it was better, people asked, why do you work with tech companies? Aren't they part of the problem? And I would say absolutely. I think they are part of the problem, but they also control a lot of the flow of information. And so our position was, if they're going to do something, wouldn't it be preferable if they did something evidence-based, and if they were open to solutions, we'd rather help them than not help them. And that worked well for a while until the incentives changed for them, right? And so we have learned is if it's not, they're not thinking about the public interest. They're thinking about their own bottom line. If they get a lot of complaints from the public, from the consumer, they're going to change their policies. Oh yes, misinformation is the problem. We need fact checkers. We need moderation, right? If public sentiment changes or if policy changes, then all of a sudden they go back to their baseline, which is we want no intervention. We want an unregulated market, really, of information, and that's tough. They've dialed back, a lot of the work that we've been doing, a lot of the success we've had, that's some of it is down the drain in terms of they're not doing anything about it because they don't have to. So we've gone the other route of trying to hold these companies accountable, for example, by getting it into the Digital Services Act, which, hopefully they can put pressure on companies, maybe through the Online Safety Act here as well, to keep implementing some of these measures. But I will say that it's, the incentives are not aligned for them, and so it's a big problem. People are also skeptical about working with government. So we like to say that but you like the government now, but what if it's a government that you don't like, right? And so for us, we only do the technique-based inoculations in the sense that, if a government is empowering the population to spot polarization or conspiracy theories or emotional manipulation, if they end up using those techniques on their own population in the future, they've only invested in making the population more resilient to their own tactics. So we thought it was a win-win to do it at that broader level. When it comes to specific claims, and we tend to not do that with social media companies or governments because there's a risk that it could be, misused.
Over to the audience. Who'd like to ask a question? In the front here, and then we'll go across, and then I'll come to the other side of the room after that.
Yeah, thank you for that. It was very engaging and really insightful. Something that you mentioned at the very beginning is really of keen interest to me, and I think maybe a couple of other people who think about geography. What is your understanding on the divide, the geographical divide on misinformation? Is it something to do with the underlying context of the places where people are living, or something else entirely? What's your opinion on that?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think the place aspect is very important. So, initially when we went into rural India, we did experiments that totally didn't work. And I think it was because people didn't understand the context. They use social media differently, for example. They're much more on WhatsApp in terms of, forwarding urgent messages rather than sarcasm on, let's say, X, right? So their understanding of how social media is used was very different. Literacy levels were very different. And also the news media environment, right? There are some countries that have been exposed for decades to propaganda, right? And so how people think about news media is very different in those countries. But actually what we found is that, when we compared, for example, Brazil to India, if you go into large urban populations in India, some of the results are the same as you see here in the West. Same with large metropolitan centers in Brazil. But if you go into urban areas, it looks very different. And actually, urban areas in Brazil and India are much more similar in their response in terms of the data than the urban sort of areas. So actually, urban-rural seemed like a much more important distinction for us in terms of the efficacy of the intervention than the country itself. Most of Western Europe looks pretty much the same in terms of the results. But rural areas in other countries, also, we've done stuff in Tunisia, for example, Libya. It's much more tricky to adapt these interventions to the local context, right? How do people think about news? How do they interact with social media? So it does require quite a bit of adaptation and working with local partners on the ground, because that's one of the things we always do. We don't know what goes on in those countries often, so we rely on local partners to implement some of these interventions. And for example, BBC Media Action has been a partner of ours, and they do a lot of work in the Global South. And so that's kind of how we thought about it. Well, we had to go back to the drawing board multiple times to make some of these interventions work in non-Western context.
Next question was here.
That was a really great talk. I'm intrigued. You've given us parallels of how to make a sort of vaccination strategy more effective. If we were on the other side of the coin, what could we do to make it less effective, or to make our misinformation agent more infectious? Could we immunosuppress the population? Can we make it more attractive when people spit it out?
Is this a question out of personal interest, or just in general?
Well, and I sort of wondered if you have evil dictators approaching you for advice through Cambridge Enterprise.
Well, through Cambridge Enterprise, I like that one. I like the subtle hint there. We work with Cambridge Enterprise a lot, so I shouldn't. But the idea is, Yeah, definitely. So we, early on, I got a call from L'Oreal, the shampoo brand, that they were having lots of misinformation about their shampoo, and if we could inoculate against their competitors. And so I started thinking about, that's not something we want to do. And then we got a call from the U.S. Embassy in the UK about whether we could spread positive truths about America. And so, because, they had image issues. And so certainly, I tell people, I'm in the business of helping people resist influence and manipulation, right? And so if you can trace some of this back to Aristotle, who talked about snake oil salesman techniques, right? And using the orator in terms of deconstructing it so that people won't be duped. And I think there's a long history of trying to use this in the public interest, but I fully take your point that a bad actor could misuse it. And so eventually what happens then is that you're in some sort of information race. And that's why I think the only solution is to actually adopt this in education, in national educational curriculums from a very early age, non-political way, so that our students, when they grow up to be adolescents and adults, that they're empowered and can resist and identify other attempts to manipulate them. And I think that's really the answer. If you look at Finland, for example, they're doing that at a large scale from a very early age. They score some of the highest scores on freedom of the press, literacy, science education. They're trying to build a really robust population that isn't susceptible to manipulation by bad actors. And I think we could learn something from that.
Midway down here, thank you.
Hi, my name is Sheyi Akiwowo. I really, really love this topic. It really relates to the concept of digital citizenship and the idea that we've got digital rights and responsibilities. And linking to the previous question about geographical location, it seems like there's a culture in Taiwan of fact-checking. There is a kind of, if you are seen to be spreading the misinformation, you're kind of like shamed, but for the good, right? What kind of social behavioral nudges do we need to be encouraging offline and online to encourage people to see themselves as digital citizens when it comes to spreading misinformation? I say this particularly because there's an issue in the black community, particularly with Diddy's court case at the moment, where a lot of misinformation is being spread just to get on those blog sites and get hits, which is already poorly moderated by social media companies. So there's a real capacity gap for minoritized communities.
Yeah, that's a great question. Multi-dimensional. Let me. I think one answer to your question is. We did this experiment once where we asked people to rate headlines, true and false, fact-checked misinformation. People didn't do so well. And then we thought, sorry again for this joke, it's just my perception. We thought, what would an economist do? And so we gave them a financial incentive. And actually, that worked really well. All of a sudden, people knew the right answer, which actually signaled to us that it's about incentivizing accuracy, that people are giving some sort of group identity signal, right, by endorsing misinformation. But actually, if you pay people, all of a sudden they do know the right answer. And so we thought, how could we leverage that? Because the reviewers were like, this is not a population-level intervention unless you're going to convince the government to spend, so many billions on incentivizing people to be accurate. So we created a social norm condition where we told people that there's a norm here of accuracy. Other participants have given accurate answers. The whole goal is to try to be as accurate as possible. And that worked, not as well as the financial incentive, but it worked pretty well. And so that, I think from that we learned that you have to have a norm of accuracy. And how that translates into, for example, the U.S. debate, I often ask, why is there are not more conservative fact-checkers in the U.S.? There's the Wall Street Journal, for example. But here there's the Financial Times, Economist, they all lean kind of right, but they're very high in accuracy. And I think, groups need to have representation who care about accuracy. And so we've tried influencer models now that we're trying to do on Instagram. Is not the WHO or not me, the Minister of Truth and Propaganda, but somebody who has connections to local communities who people pay attention to on Instagram and TikTok. So we try to use influencers. to actually incentivize accuracy in some experiments. And what I said to the House of Lords was that there are some minorities, including BAME communities, that obviously have good reasons for distrusting authorities because they have been experimented on in the past. And even though the misinformation now might not be accurate, there's the problem of building trust. And some people say that the problem is not misinformation; it's lack of trust. But I think it's a cyclical relationship. It's like a complex system, right? That if you don't trust, you're going to seek out low-quality information sources or alternative information sources, which then increases distrust, right? And maybe if you're duped by misinformation, that causes distrust. So I think it's this sort of feedback loop that we need to get out of. And so, yeah, building trust with audiences so they're more likely to uptake is another one.
Thank you. Right over here at this side.
Ben Martin from the Science Policy Research Unit. You mentioned that you did some randomized control experiments to check that this is a genuine effect here. So there was a placebo. I'm intrigued. What does a placebo psychological inoculation look like if it has to be sufficiently convincing to the people that it's being imparted that it might be the genuine vaccine? So just tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, so we've run about maybe 30 randomized experiments, and the control group is usually, for the games, it's another game that doesn't teach people about misinformation. So it's a gamified control group, right? So it gives people, they play Tetris for 20 minutes. And then you see there's no change whatsoever in the control group. People still pretty much suck at identifying misinformation. Then with videos, we gave people an ad about freezer burn or cooking rice as the control condition. So on the YouTube experiment, it was randomized, but on a real social media platform, it's a bit tricky. So we rely on YouTube to do proper randomization. But so they can make sure that the accounts don't overlap and things like that in terms of contamination. But the algorithm does interfere a little bit because it does unpredictable things. But for the most part, half of it saw the inoculation video, the other half saw the cooking rice video, and then we test people. We've tried to do more stricter controls, for example, giving people media literacy tips versus the inoculation, because that's specifically about the weakened dose of the misinformation rather than just giving people tips. In the WHO one, we had the UNESCO did an infographics campaign that was the passive control. That was a real-world intervention they were running on their own that we compared it against. Both worked, but the inoculation worked a little better because people were more motivated and they thought the game was more fun than an infographic, for example. So we do a lot of randomized experiments where we try to figure out, with different placebos, what the effect is and how it gets, diluted and interference. So how do you make the inoculation less effective? One is, if 1 million people have liked a post, even when people are inoculated, they're going to be a little bit tempted. So social endorsement can be a challenge. When the misinformation is politically congenial to people, they struggle a bit more. And so we try to figure out all of these aspects.
Time for one more, maybe two in the middle there. Thank you.
Try to be brief. Me, yeah.
Saskia Smelly from
Everybody.
the ESRC.
Oh, okay.
I was just wondering what impact the source of the misinformation plays, or the narrator of the misinformation, both in it being a persuasive bit of information or inoculating against it.
Yeah, great question. So initially we blanked out the source because we wanted to avoid source confounds. But then we came back to the source idea. And actually what we find is that, we did this by partisanship, is that if the source aligns with your political identification in the US, so Fox News if you're conservative, CNN if you're liberal, because those are the most polarized ones, then you find the misinformation more persuasive if it comes from a source that is aligned with your identity. If it's not aligned with your identity, you find the misinformation less persuasive. And the inoculation effect is still there, but it's a little bit lower for when the source is congenial to your ideology. And so we manipulated the same headline, but either coming from CNN or Fox News, for example. So that does interfere a little bit. And of course, in reality, people see sources, so we have to take that into account. So we try to devise a new inoculation that sort of takes into account, like, is the source biased, right? You have to think about that, and what's the accuracy of a source. But yeah, absolutely.
Who would like the last question? Matthew in the front here.
Thank you. Great talk. You mentioned briefly that you're concerned about whether this is primarily supply-driven or demand-side driven.
Yeah.
Could you elaborate a bit more on that? I'm really interested in the demand-side stuff.
Yeah, so there is a bit of a debate, and this came back to your question as well, Diane, about are people being duped by false information, right? There are people at the top spreading it, and then regular people are duped by it, or are people demanding misinformation from the bottom up because they want to consume information that aligns with their political biases, right? So people are motivated in their perception and in their search, and even if it wasn't being supplied, people would be willing to search it out because they're motivated. And I think both can be true at the same time, in the sense that sometimes people are motivated to confirm their biases, obviously, and we selectively search out information. But it's also true that people at the top are just spraying a fire hose of false information that can also derail people's thinking about a problem at the same time. But in terms of the interventions, it's slightly different, right? So do you want to empower people at the individual level, or do you want to cut off the supply, right? So you can work with people in terms of reducing their demand for it by empowering them with the types of skills that we're building here, or we could just try to, for example, one intervention. We know that most of the misinformation is spread by a minority of super spreaders, not quite like a Pareto principle, but 80% of the misinformation comes from about 20% of super spreaders, if you look at it from a network point of view. So you could just deplatform the super spreaders with a policy intervention. The problem is that they go somewhere else and then radicalize further. So there are externalities that are negative in that sense. So another way is to have structural interventions on social media, right? Change their incentives so that they're going to lower the supply of it by regulating them in some way. That's why what we try to do with the Trust and Safety Index is showing the price of manipulation. What does it cost to buy a fake account on this platform in this country right now? Is it spiking during an election? If a company learns that that it's easy to buy fake accounts on their platform, that's bad press, right? Maybe they want to do something about it. Or maybe policymakers could say, look, in our country, it's easy for people to be manipulated. You need to do something about this, right? And then they can actually change their platform, their algorithms, how things work to reduce increase the barriers, right? So to actually reduce it. But from a psychological point of view, the question's often, what's driving that price? Are people demanding fake accounts and they want to engage in it, or is it that it's being advertised and people are responding to that?
Sander.
I don't know if that fully answers the question, but happy to chat more.
I think you're going to have to chat more afterwards.
Yeah.
There are lots more questions, but thank you so much. Great talk, great Q&A.
My pleasure. Thank you. Thanks, everyone.